Hello. Well, this is me, I'm Ron Bailey, and this is going to serve as a sort of video notebook of a session that we spent with our little life group, as we call it. These are young teenagers, just a few of them. And we're beginning a series of studies into the book of Daniel, and I'll explain why we've chosen Daniel to start with this in just a moment. So this is how we start off. So Daniel and co. daring to be different. So this is our New Covenant Church life group. This is episode 1, and the subtitle really is Deportation to Babylon. So we'll move on. When new reporters are enlisted in a newspaper, in the old days, they used to give the new reporters a series of questions and a notebook and a pencil. And if they went to an event and they were required to report on that event, well, what they would do is they would have these questions in mind. But before I do that, let me ask a question, because this is the question I asked to the youngsters. If you think about the Bible and you think about the different books that are in the Bible, how much of the Bible do you think is narrative? That's to say, how much of the Bible do you think is a storyline? In the stories part of the Bible, it's actually a third. That's a big amount. And there's a reason for that. It's because we seem to be hardwired to like stories. Stories give a pattern to things. They give a shape to things. They give a before and a now and an after. And they're a great way of learning. And we remember stories. As a preacher, I know that very often people will remember my illustrations far better than they will remember my actual preaching. So that's a bit of a warning for us preachers as well. So a third of the Bible. So obviously we know that Jesus used stories. We usually call them parables. And they have a way of kind of gripping and enabling us to remember these things. So these are the reporters' questions when they are creating their story for their newspaper. Series of questions. The first question, who? Who are the characters in this story? Who is the cast list in these stories? It's important to know who we're talking about. Secondly, what's this story about? What is the storyline? What's the story going to be telling us? And to make that more clear, we have a third question, where? Where did this happen? It's amazing how often in the Bible we find that the details of a story are given very specific details as to where they actually happened and when. Often it will say 2 days later, or it'll say on the 3rd year of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, this happened or this happened. It date stamps so often the events, and it gives a geographical location. This is all setting the scene for the young reporter. And then, of course, we have the question, why? Did we do when? Okay, we did when. That's important too, because times change. There's an old saying amongst historians when they say the past is a foreign country, they did things differently there. And even in the Bible, we have New Covenant and Old Covenant. We have the Old Covenant scriptures, often called the Old Testament, and we have the New Covenant scriptures, often called the New Testament. Well, these are two different stories in two different time zones, in the sense that a covenant establishes a pattern of its own, an era of its own. So we have the Old Covenant and we have the New Covenant. And these, although they have connections, they're actually quite different. And things don't happen in the Old Covenant in the way that they happen in the New Covenant, and vice versa. Okay? Why? Why are we telling this story? What's the point of this story? Whose attention am I trying to capture with this story? And sixth, whence. One of our young folk didn't know the word whence. It's obviously an archaic word. I said, well, basically it means where do we go from here? Or sometimes it means where did we come from to get to here? It puts it into a time context, a time line. Okay, so let's begin, shall we, with where? This is a map of an area that we usually, I asked the questions, and immediately, of course, the youngsters said, yeah, this is the Middle East. Now, I ought to say this for anyone who are listening, that this is a series, this little study was not interrupted, but was engaged with all the way through this. In other words, these folk are not just sitting there listening to me. This is a conversation going on. And they're asking questions. They're asking more questions than I'm answering. So I'm pausing all the time to answer bits of questions at different things. You may have your own questions. But this is the Middle East. And at one particular time, we'll show when in a moment, at one particular time, these were the superpowers of their day. And if you want to go through them in a time kind of way, well, the first one would be Egypt, and you know how their empire impacted upon what we sometimes call as the Holy Land, and the way that the people of Israel, or at least the sons of Abraham, of Isaac went down into Egypt, and the impact of the Egyptian empire upon them. Following them came the Assyrian Empire, and these empires were always at one another's throats because each one wanted to be the top dog. So you have constant conflict between the Egyptian Empire and the Assyrian Empire. Assyria is not the same as Assyria. It's close, but it's not the same. And then the third of these mega empires is Babylonia. So you start off with the Egyptian, and then the Assyrians begin to push down, and as a result of that, the northern kingdom of Israel, because Israel split into two kingdoms, you remember, so that in the end of this particular period, there were two kingdoms. There was Israel, the 10, we'll call them the 10, Israel, the 10 tribes, and Judah, the 2 tribes, 2.5 in a sense, but we'll just stick to 2 to make it simple. Okay, so the Assyrians came down and they took captive. They destroyed Samaria, the capital of the northern kingdom of Israel, and they took the people captive. More about that in a moment or two. And then later on, the Babylonian Empire rose almost from the dead, because that had been an old empire, but this is the second Babylonian Empire. And they conquered Assyria, and then they began to control this area. The little line is actually the trade routes and the warfare routes. This is how they went backwards and forwards. The bit in the middle, sandy coloured, if my colour vision problems don't obscure it, that's desert. So they always went in this kind of direction. And then in our story part, then Babylonia became the ruling mega empire. And later on in the story, not in our series this time, of course, we'll come onto the Greek Empire under Alexander, and then we'll come to the Roman Empire under the Caesars. Okay, so that's where roughly it is. But if we were going to say more accurately where it is, what is the scene here? And most people would think, well, surely it's going to be Jerusalem. You would have thought so, wouldn't you? But actually, it's not. It's going to be Babylon. And there's a reason for that. So we can tick where and move on to the when. This is just a simple table that I've picked up from somewhere. And when the Babylonians began to control this whole area, On three, maybe four occasions, there were deportations of the population of Judah. The first one took place round about 600 BC, and the dates go down as you go forwards in before Christ. And then there was another one, and then another one, and it was that it was the third one, which you can see here where it says the siege and fall of Jerusalem, Solomon's temple destroyed. This, in a sense, was the final one. This brought the kingdom of Judah to an end, and from then on, they were really, before that they'd been puppet kings, but from this time on they were just a province, and they had a governor ruling them, who was the executive of Babylon itself. So it was during the first of these deportations that what the Babylonians did, and they often did this, these mighty empires, is that when they conquered somewhere, they would sometimes leave the king on the throne, or they would substitute a king of their own, sometimes a member of the royal family, to give some kind of sense of continuity. But often they would also take the children, particularly the sons of the kings, into captivity as hostages to make sure that the king, let's work it out on the map. In other words, they would take the children of the king of Jerusalem into Babylon so that the king in Jerusalem would behave himself and be a proper puppet king for Babylonia. Well, that's what they did. And in AD 609, round about 600 you could say, during the reign of Jehoiakim, who had succeeded Jehoahaz, who had replaced Josiah, but only reigned for 3 months, they began to give tribute to Nebuchadnezzar. And there was the first deportation. And they took what I'm going to call the pick of the crop. They took the best people in Judah. They took the nobility, they took the brightest, and they took them to Babylon. And we'll show why in a moment or two. And then quite some time after, in fact, kind of 20 years later, what happened was that there was the final siege and the fall of Jerusalem, and the walls were broken down, and Solomon's temple was destroyed, and the independent kingdom of Judah came to an end. So that was when? Where should we go next? Okay, why? I've got my own questions here for the why bit. It's very simple. There are three. We're going to look at some of the story that we find in the book of Daniel, the first few chapters really, and we're going to ask the question, what is happening here? That's the same as question 2 for the reporters. What? How do we describe this? And one way of describing a section of the Bible is sometimes to pretend you're not the newspaper reporter now, but the newspaper editor. And the report comes to you and you look at it and you have to create a snappy headline that somehow gathers together enough of it to draw people in to want to read it. So that's a good way of reading parts of the Bible, to read it and ask yourself the question, what is all this about? And if I was going to give a heading for it, a newspaper heading for it, what would I call it? So my first question would be what? What is happening? I do this constantly, even now. As I read passages of the scripture, I ask myself the question, what is happening here? How would I describe this particular section? Secondly, so what? In other words, what are the implications of this? This isn't a protest, it's like saying, so what? It's not an aggressive, antagonistic protest. It's just simply a question. So what? So this is what happened, but why? What's it all about? So what? What are the implications of this? And thirdly, now what? In other words, what's it got to do with me? What does God expect me to do in a response to this particular part of the Bible. In fact, there are two keys that I use quite often when I'm doing this, in fact, very often. And they're pretty simple, but they're Bible verses. Now, we thought we were going to be using the Good News Bible, but we didn't have sufficient, so there was a mixture of Bibles, and we'll see which Bible we use for next time. I think probably I'm going to advise that we use the New King James Version for all kinds of reasons. But this is Deuteronomy chapter 29, almost at the end of Deuteronomy, when Moses has gathered the people together, still on the eastern side of the River Jordan, but they're about to move in to invade the land that's been promised to them. And he gathers them together, and he says this to them, these people who are the covenant people of God. They have entered into an agreement with God, which has both promises and obligations for both sides. God makes his promises, and he is honor bound to keep them. The people make their promises, and they are honor bound to keep them. But they didn't. But that's the story as it develops. So let's look at Deuteronomy 29:29. This is the New King James Version. The secret things belong to the Lord our God. This tells us that God has not revealed everything to us. The Bible is not like a kind of a history book of the whole world. It's not an encyclopedia. It's a highly selected group of writings that are given to us for a particular purpose. It's because although many things belong to God as secrets, and we don't have the power or the strength to carry them yet, or they're not relevant for us in our particular time, God will reveal truth to us when it's necessary. And what he'd done up to this point is he'd revealed certain truth to them, and he says the secret things belong to Jehovah. That's their name for their God. The secret things belong to the Lord our God. So we don't know everything. But those which are revealed, those things which are revealed, belong to us and to our children forever. So the things that God has revealed to us are ours. The things that God has opened up to us in the teaching of the Scripture and in the way that he speaks into our lives, we become accountable for that extra truth that we have. According to our light, we will be judged. And if God has given much light, then the judgment will be much more strenuous. Those things are revealed. They belong to us and to our children. So we are responsible, just to pass them on to the next generation? Well, yes, but we're also responsible to do them. So you've got three things in this verse, great verse. The secret things belong to the Lord our God. But those things which are revealed belong to us and to our children forever, that we may do all the works of the Lord. The Bible is not given to us to educate us primarily. It's not given to us so that we've got much more information about things. It's given to us because God is speaking to us still, and he expects us to walk in the light of the truth that he reveals to us. That is true of both of the great covenants. So let's kind of move on to the second of these keys. Again, we'll just concentrate on the New King James Version. This is Paul writing to the Corinthians, and he's reminding them that to start well doesn't mean that you finish well. And he reminds them of God's people, how they entered into this covenant with God and they became God's own unique people. But they didn't obey what God had said to them. And many of them, the majority of them, never arrived at their destination. They never got to the promised land. Tens of thousands of graves in the wilderness en route to the promised land. Let me just read 1 Corinthians 10, verse 11. Now all these things happened to them as examples, and they were written for our admonition. That's kind of like a solemn warning. They were written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the ages have come. That's take this line by line. All these things happened. In other words, the Bible, when it recounts these historic stories, is authentic history. These things actually happened. They're not made up stories. This is God's view and God's interpretation often of events. But these things happened to them as examples. They were written for our admonition. So they happened to the people of Israel, and they were recorded because they had lasting significance. And God's people, as they followed generation after generation, could be reminded of the acts of power and of the words that God had spoken to them and of the record. So these things really happened, and they were written for our admonition, not just for the old covenant people, but these things in the old covenant account were actually written for the new covenant people. That's why we should not neglect the Old Testament, but we must keep it in its place and understand that light comes from the New Testament, which makes things clear in the Old Testament. Let's just remind ourselves of where we've got to with this. So we've answered some questions. We've got the who, we've got the what, we've got the where, we've got the when, we've got the why, we've got the whence. And remember, so much of this Bible is narrative, it's story. So let's see where that takes us to. What have we dealt with so far? Well, we've done the where and we've done the when. Let's have a look at the who. This is effectively the cast list. And if the reporter is making a record of this, they want to know all the people who are involved. So we've got our Bible. I'm going to get my old Bible that I've got just within my reach here. And I'm looking for Daniel chapter 1. There it is. Daniel chapter 1. And we'll work our way through this just a little bit at a time. So, who is the first person on our character list? Well, here's Daniel chapter 1 and verse 1. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar. Okay, so we've got another character in our character list. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, came Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, to Jerusalem and besieged it. We're back in roundabout BC 609 to about 600, somewhere around there. So we've got two characters, we've got two kings. We've got Jehoiakim, who according to this, it says this is the reign of Jehoiakim, who succeeded Jehoahaz, who replaced Josiah, but he only reigned for 3 months. And this is when they began to give tribute to Nebuchadnezzar, and then they stopped it. And the consequence was that there was a first deportation. And almost certainly, I would say 99.9%, it's this group that Daniel was part of and his 3 friends. They took away a certain group. Let's see. So we've got 2 kings. We've got Jehoiakim and Nebuchadnezzar. And I encourage them to see, by reading Daniel chapter 1 and verse 2, if they could see another king. So here's verse 2. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, now we've already got Jehoiakim on our list. The Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, that's into the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar. That's another name for Babylon, for Babylonia, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. So I asked them if they could see in Daniel chapter 1 and verse 2 another king. We've already got Jehoiakim, we've got Nebuchadnezzar. Who's this third king? Well, listen how it expresses this. It doesn't say that Nebuchadnezzar took them away, although he did. What it says is this: the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, with part of the vessels of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar, to the house of his God. And he brought the vessels into the treasure house of his God. There's another king. There's a king over all the kings. There's one who is the king of the universe and all the universes, if there's more than one. And he is the king of time. He is absolutely on the throne. All other kings reign subject to him. And he raises up people to rule and puts down people who have been ruling with his wisdom. Okay. And you may think you live in a democracy, and we do. We make choices, and those choices we are responsible for, and we will be accountable for the choices that we made. But over all this, there is another throne, another king. And that's what Daniel, the book of Daniel, really reveals in two ways. It reveals in the personal history of these four young men, but it also reveals it in the way that God predicts history through Daniel. Let's see how we get on to that. So, and then there's another character here coming up in verse 3. And the king spoke to Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs. Eunuchs is not necessarily physical eunuchs, although it would have included those possibly, but it became used as a title for the senior officials of the king's court. These were people who initially would have been eunuchs, but as time went on, it wasn't only eunuchs who were called eunuchs, but they may have been eunuchs. And the king spoke to Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, that he should bring certain of the children of Israel and of the king's seed. Okay, so this deportation is going to include members of the royal family, members of the nobility, children, verse 4, in whom was no blemish, but well favoured, means they were good-looking boys, skillful in all wisdom, and cunning in knowledge, and understanding science. These really were an amazing group of people. So this is all the work of Ashpenaz. He's been given this name. I've spelt the name wrong there. It ought to be where's it gone? It ought to be Ashpenaz. Somebody pointed that out to me. It's good to have kind of people who are attentive. Okay, so this is Ashpenaz, and this was his job, to select from the members, and they were the cream of the group to start off with, to choose these people who would have a particular destiny. They had a career mapped out for them, and this is what they had in mind. Children, they were of the children of Israel, of the king's seed. That's to say, they were the royal family. Whether Daniel and his friends were actually members of the royal family, we don't know. They may have been some of the princes, but certainly they were the top draw of the people in Judah. Children in whom was no blemish, well favoured, and skillful in all wisdom. These are bright youngsters, and the bunch that we have are bright youngsters. And cunning in all knowledge. Well, they haven't got to all knowledge yet, but they're very well informed on all kinds of things, and understanding science, and such as had ability in them to stand in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. So this is the pick of the crop, and they're going to be taken and given an exclusive experience. They are going to be educated in all the ways, in all the mindset, in all the ways that Babylon did things. The idea is these are young people. They are flexible. They are impressionable. They are bright. And Nebuchadnezzar has a plan for them that's going to be worked out through Ashpenaz, to whom they might teach the learning and the tongue of the Chaldeans. What they're going to do is they're going to conform these young leaders, potential leaders of Judah, into thoroughgoing Babylonians. They're going to give them the language. They're going to make them familiar with everything that works. They're going to give them plush jobs. They're going to lavish wonderful things on them. They're going to share the king's food with them. They really are going to be a unique elite group. And the logic behind is this, that when the king back in Jerusalem is no longer there, they'll have a Babylonian substitute that they'll be able to refer to as someone from Judah, but who has become thoroughgoing Babylonian in his thinking. And the king, verse 5, the king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat. This is significant because all these empires were kind of religious empires in a sense. They all had their gods and they all performed their sacrifices to their gods, and their kings were looked upon as appointed by the gods, and they worshipped the gods, and they made sacrifices to the gods, and then some of those sacrifices were put on the marketplace to the shambles where they sold meat, but also they would be used by the top people. So what's going to happen here is, if these 4 boys are going to be feeding on the king's meat, they're going to be food. They're going to be feeding on stuff which are being offered to idols. And this is going to become a crucial thing for them. The king appointed them a daily provision of the king's meat and of the wine which he drank, so nourishing them 3 years. Now, this is part of the reason I've come to Daniel, because our particular group, they have potential, and if it's the Lord's will, you can see that all of them would probably be destined for 3 years at university, where they will no longer be under the special influence of family and their local church, and where they will be in an attractive context with all kinds of exciting, inviting things surrounding them, and where they will be schooled in the ways of the worldview of the era in which we live. And the era in which we live has changed dramatically. I saw an article just in the Times just 2 or 3 days ago from when I'm recording this, in which it said the previous generation, the era that we're now living in is unrecognizable to the previous generation. It's true. And I am from the previous generation. So you can imagine what our generation see of this. It's hardly recognizable. It's a different world. It's a different world that our young people are growing up with. And it has a worldview and a mindset. And it has behind it an agent whose determination is to conform things to the way he wants things to be done. That's what's going to happen. And this is why Paul wrote, and why it's still so relevant today. He said, I beseech you, therefore, brethren, by the mercies of God, that you yield your bodies a living sacrifice, holy, acceptable to God, which is your reasonable service, not being shaped by the world. The world has a mission. The power that's behind it has a mission to get our young people thinking like the world thinks, Now, we don't have to be nervous about this. We don't have to be kind of looking for an enemy around every corner. We don't have to be hostile to the people who are actually propagating this particular worldview. We need to understand that our battle is not with them. It's in the heavenly places. And our weapons are not carnal, but they're spiritual, and we mustn't use carnal methods. So we'll say more of this as time kind of goes on. But these 4 young men are beginning 3-year training away from home, away from all the things that remind them. And one of the first things we shall see that happens is that their names are changed. Each of these 4 young men has a name that ends either in Aya, and that's actually a diminutive form of the word Yah, or Jehovah. So 2 of them have names which end with, if you like, Jehovah, and the other 2 have names which end in El, which is the noun God. So all 4 of these young men have some reference to God built into their names. They obviously come from godly families. They come from families where they've been privileged. They've had things, they've learned things, they've ready to kind of go on to the next stage, and here they are now. They've lost everything. They've lost every familiar contact with home. It's all gone, and there's no prospect of it ever being restored to them. So why not just compromise? Why not just go with the flow and do life the way the Babylonians do it? Let's just survive, shall we? Well, these young people had another instinct within them, and there were more important things than surviving. There's an old story told about a man named C.T. Studd, who was a missionary. He came from a very wealthy family, but he'd given it all away, and he was a missionary in Africa. And he believed that God wanted him to trust God alone for all his needs and his supplies. So he had no income. He'd given that away. He had no regular salary from a missionary society or anything like this. He just believed that God would keep them. And he was working in Africa. And an English dentist went out to join him, a Christian man, who wanted to work alongside him and felt he had some things that he could offer. And when he got there, he found that C.T. Studd operated this kind of financial pattern for his life where he didn't have any regular income. He couldn't budget, because you need to know what's coming in before you can budget. He couldn't make any of these plans. All that he could do really was to pray and trust God to guide him, believing, I think this was one of his sayings as well, that God's work done in God's way at God's time will never lack God's resources. But the dentist observed this way of life and decided he wasn't very keen on it. And on one occasion he had a kind of a little dispute with C.T. Studd. And he said to C.T. Studd, he said, "This way of doing things is ridiculous. It's crazy. We can't plan anything. It's unworkable. We've got to live after all." And C.T. Studd said, "Not necessarily." And there was something of that attitude in these young boys. You will find later on there comes a place in which if they behave one way, they'll live, and if they behave another way, they'll die. And you could have said, well, this is ridiculous. And they said, we may burn, but we won't bow. We'll see that later on. Okay, so that's it. That's just to give you a picture of where we're up to. And 2 weeks after that one, God willing, we shall meet together again. So, thanks for coming. See you next time. Bye.